You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
The podcast where we explore the bold ideas, people, and partnerships shaping the future of housing in Canada. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly, and today we're diving into one of the biggest questions facing our sector. How do we truly scale affordable and non-market housing? Joining me are two incredible leaders helping to answer that question. Adrienne Pacini, partner at SHS Consulting, and Carolyn Whitzman, adjunct professor and senior housing researcher. Together, we unpack what scale really means, how portfolio and innovation approaches are reshaping the sector, and the partnerships, policies, and financing tools that can help move ideas from pilot projects to permanent homes. Let's jump in. Thank you, Adrienne and Carolyn, for joining us on the way home today. For all our listeners, Adrienne and Carolyn are being extremely generous with us. We actually recorded this episode and lost it. So I will not say third time's the charm, because in this case, second time's the charm.
Hope so.
Why don't we ask you both what home means to you? And we'll start with you, Carolyn.
Well, last year I was on the program and I was very well prepared, and I brought my new book, Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis, which actually has a paragraph that talks about the meaning of home, but I'll try to summarize it from memory. For me, a home is a place of safety, of security, a place where you can get away after a long day, where you can entertain with friends, and where you are able not just to access shelter, but also dignity.
Maybe I'll choose one characteristic of home then to build on what Carolyn shared. So I would say it's a place that you should feel proud of, because it's a reflection of you, and it's somewhere you feel like you would see bringing people or talking about or just feeling good about yourself in this place because you feel proud.
And to our listeners, we're so lucky to have both Adrienne and Carolyn on. They're both experts, and both of you have spent years examining how to scale affordable and non-market housing. From your perspectives, what does scale actually mean in the context of community housing? And why is it so important right now? Carolyn, we'll start with you and then move to Adrienne.
Well, interestingly, in that question, you used three different terms: affordable, non-market, and community. We also sometimes use social housing. It all, with the exception of affordable, all three terms mean the same thing, which is housing that's outside market forces. And countries that have been relatively successful in the last few years in, for instance, Finland, in bringing down the number of homeless people, addressing and preventing homelessness, have used non-market housing, low-cost housing with supports to help support that endeavor. And in France, where 15% of low-income tenants are living in unaffordable housing, they've also used targets for non-market housing, 20% for all municipalities, which increased, that was in 2020, which increased to 25% in 2016, to help accomplish a goal. And the goal was fewer people living in overpriced homes, particularly low-income renters. I should say that 15% is still high, but in Canada, 55% of low-income renters are in unaffordable housing. So you can see the difference between 15 and 55. To me, non-market housing is a really proven effective mechanism, as long as it's backed up by targets like ending homelessness or making sure that everyone has access to an affordable and adequate and secure home. And scaling up means whatever number it takes to accomplish those objectives.
Yeah, I love that Carolyn's response really focused on the impact and how it affects people. And then I think maybe to add a different dimension to it, in our work in innovation at SHS, we like to look at phenomena and trends like the idea of scale. And we ask ourselves, what does that movement mean for the future of the housing ecosystem in terms of, the way it works and that sort of thing. So it feels like the flavor of scale today has a lot to do in Canada, at least when we're talking about it. It has a lot to do with the context of real estate portfolios. So the size of that portfolio, our ability as members of the community housing sector to develop, our ability to negotiate and have kind of the power to negotiate and act quickly when there's different opportunities in housing development. So we can think of that in different types of lenses. So one is maybe our ability to do more, efficiently and effectively. So we talk about scale in terms of the context of employing new models or approaches that allow us to do more due to maybe the momentum that we achieve as an organization through our size or our breadth. And so I think we'll talk about some examples of that more on this podcast and the work that Carolyn and I are doing together with our groups. And then there's, the scale of the opportunity. So does the sector have the ability to respond to big opportunities? So for example, coming together on a big government land that's available, or these mall sites that we're seeing around the GTA. And then maybe the last one is like replication as scale. So at the system level, promising models and examples, the more they can be easily adopted and replicated in the housing sector, it means that we're learning from past experiences. So we're not all having to restart from scratch every time. So there's some scale involved in that too, from the growth of a sector perspective. And all of that is bubbling up to the points that Carolyn made right off the top about it should all be directed towards the impact we're hoping to have.
Yeah, I just want to build on something that Adrienne said, which is there's a really good report called More with Less that was published by Harvard's Housing Center a few years ago, and it looked at non-market housing across the U.S. and what were money-saving measures, because we're all concerned about the cost of housing, which isn't just about rents or house prices, but it's also about how much it costs to construct new housing. And definitely, if you can build bigger developments like 200 at a time instead of 6 or 20 at a time, that's going to save money. If you're able to have a steady pipeline and hire the best people and retain the best people and provide, growth opportunities for really good young developers, that's going to save money over time. And in terms of industrial construction, for instance, you can't set up a factory or hire workers to produce housing in factories without a steady pipeline. So all of those things are really important to thinking about scale.
Carolyn, you've worked recently on the CMHC Solutions Lab report about regional portfolio approaches. Could you explain what a portfolio approach looks like in practice and how it might change how governments and nonprofits think about housing supply?
Sure, Emmy. So this is a report that's related to the Solutions Lab that Adrienne and I are working on. And we looked at 3 case studies of organizations that were bundling their assets, by which I mean they were sharing equity, they were sharing assets, they were also sharing things like information in order to work together. And one of the characteristics that we're looking at is a set of non-market providers and developers. So in the first case, the BC Community Land Trust, that was a group that brought together a whole bunch of co-ops in BC, but also some social service agencies. And together, they were able to successfully bid on 11 pieces of land held by the city of Vancouver. And they're now at 3,000 homes and have another at least 500 in the pipeline. So that's been established for a few years. The second case study that we looked at was much newer, and that was a collaboration between Ottawa Community Housing, the Public Housing Authority of Ottawa, and 3 supportive housing organizations that didn't necessarily want to be in the business of development, but felt that they were providing services that were appropriate for particular populations, Gignal with Indigenous people, options with people who were newly off the street, chronic homeless folks, and Salus, which does mental health work. So together they came up with a pipeline of pieces of City of Ottawa land that it hoped to develop as supportive housing, and that helped the Public Housing Authority, partly by keeping their development staff busy, but also public housing quite often gets people at the top of the waiting list who need supports as well as low-cost housing. So it was a win-win for the city, for the Public Housing Authority, and for the supportive housing providers. The third example that we looked at, Plancher, is still in the process of forming. It's in Quebec, and the notion is bringing together a lot of non-market developers along with finance folks, unions, and governments to again work towards a steady pipeline approach of scaling up non-market housing. And they went into it with a goal of 5,000 homes to be developed over the next 5 or so years, which I think is the kind of scale that we need to be talking about, hundreds, if not thousands of homes in order to meet people's needs. So that's what the report was about.
Very cool. Is the second project you referenced in Ottawa, is that Bumblebee?
Bumblebee, that's right.
Oh, awesome. We have, we're going to have Cliff on the pod to talk.
I was just talking with Cliff this week. So I can include a link to the project that you can talk about and the reports there, and also some workshops we've done since then.
Amazing. Adrienne, over to you. Your work focuses on innovation labs, as you mentioned earlier, and collaborative strategies. What have you learned about what it takes to do innovation in the housing sector beyond just the buzzword?
Yeah, so the groups who we tend to work with, who are really looking to undertake some sort of innovation initiative, usually they start by sensing a problem that they are looking to solve. Maybe they have a need that they want to fill, maybe there's an opportunity to jump on. So I think the examples that Carolyn gave of those case studies, they usually stemmed from some sort of kind of catalytic moment where those groups said, hey, we need to do something differently. We need to, bundle our assets in this very specific case and come up with a new way of working. Usually it also requires a positive change equation. So if you've heard of the Beckard-Harris change model, we know that a group's ambition for change, their vision for what that change looks like for the future, and their action plan, all of that has to be a greater force than the resistance to change, for change to actually take place. So we know in these conversations, usually kind of getting over that hurdle of resistance to change is big. And a lot of this is actually kind of a change management activity when we think of innovation. There's many different similar to the flavors of scale, there's many different ways that you can innovate or how these models emerge that Carolyn was naming. So sometimes it's a group who's seeking out, a new way of working within their organization, or maybe they want to take on a new role in the housing system. So the examples where there's, a lead organization who says, hey, we're going to play the development function for the housing sector in our jurisdiction or our, local municipality, for instance. That's taking on a new role in the system, and that means that you probably need to kind of concentrate some certain capabilities that allow you to take on that role and expertise. Maybe your innovation is about looking towards a new type of interaction or relationship. So maybe it's not that I'm going to take on a new role, but I want to actually work differently or interact differently with another group in the housing system. Or maybe we want to, all together create some sort of new service offering or value proposition. I think, Emmy at Blue Door, and for the people who listen to the podcast and know a lot about your initiatives, your Construct program is a really good example where you saw an opportunity around training in the trades and how that could actually impact the housing sector. And then similar with your Housing for All initiative that Blue Door is working on. It's another really good example of playing a new role in the housing system. And I guess in the sector, we've really seen innovations succeed when we're applying multiple lenses to what that solution, a good solution, might entail. So we start by rigorously asking, why are we doing this? Are we solving a problem? And then, is the solution that we're coming up with, is it desirable? Is it something that people actually want? Is it feasible? Can we do it technically? And is it financially viable? So does it make sense financially? And then you actually have to implement it. So coming up with an idea is really just like an invention when I have to actually implement it in the real world, and you have to build all the other systems around it so that the thing can live and exist and work and sustain in the real world. Like, you might need to develop a governance model or agreements or mechanisms or a business model to make it work. That's really what transforms an invention or an idea into actually an innovation on the ground.
Were you going to add something, Carolyn, just then?
I could. Earlier this year, I was in New Brunswick for the New Brunswick Nonprofit Housing Association conference, and there was a survey done of non-market providers in New Brunswick, and I think it came up with a really useful quadrant. There are organizations that are really not interested in changing very much. So those might be organizations like a co-op that has, 30 units in it, and the people there are really happy and the place is well managed and they're fine just as it is. They're not going to expand. They're not necessarily going to work with other non-market providers. There are non-market organizations that are coming to the end of a life cycle, and they're considering whether they should continue or merge with another organization. So, they're facing an aging board, or they're facing just declining energy, and they're generally pretty small. There's about 8,000 non-market providers across Canada, 2,800 in Quebec alone, and really only about 20, maybe 25, possibly 30 have the capacity to do large scale, like 300 plus type portfolios that, for instance, Build Canada Homes is talking about. Then there's organizations that are interested in change, the kind of organizations that would come to SHS or other development consultancies. And in some cases, they're really interested in, I'm actually going to put the two other quadrants together. You have to be interested in growth in order to be interested in change, or you have to be interested in change if you're going to be interested in growth. And you can either do that as a much stronger organization, or in some cases, you can do it as part of a much stronger partnership that doesn't necessarily involve merging or being acquired. It might involve acquiring some of those other declining non-market providers that I was talking about earlier. So the folks who are interested in change and growth have a series of choices in front of them. And one of the choices is definitely growing as a single organization. And another option, and it doesn't necessarily need to contradict the option of growing as an organization, is working together to try to get to that critical mass where you can do big things with big pieces of land or with multiple pieces of land at the same time.
I love the point that you brought up about partnerships. Doesn't all have to be one organization or one person, and you've both emphasized collaboration as key to progress. What kind of partnerships between governments, nonprofits, private actors would you say are most effective for scaling community housing? Adrienne and then Carolyn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I'll answer your question with a response that's kind of about how does the partnership maybe come to be, and what does it look like? So I would say a lot of the successful partnership conversations that we've been part of usually start with a conversation of how can we all leverage what we each do best. So starting the conversation with, what can you bring to the table? And for each group, that might look like something different, and how to actually assign value to those different things that we bring is often where kind of the sticky conversation can can go, but it's important to get through those conversations and see what we can each bring to the table. And then really from there, it's like, okay, well, what are we missing? So do we have the right group in the room? Are we missing anything at the table? And that conversation requires like understanding yourself, understanding your organization, understanding what type of risk you're willing to take if it, to make this partnership possible, and what your core capabilities are. And sometimes it actually has groups step back and say, well, what is actually our business strategy and our value proposition as an organization in the housing sector anyway? And so sometimes it's actually that nice opportunity to ask yourself that. And then maybe the second piece of how these partnerships can often, work out in a successful way is if we really remember that the partnerships are relational. So successful ones are ones that take the time to understand, where each group is coming from. So if I'm coming to this conversation with, a pain point or a thought, or here's what I'm willing to bring, what is driving that perspective? What are their motivations? What are, the factors their board has to take into account? What are their constraints? And how does that organization make decisions? So actually taking the time to understand that of each other. And the relational piece allows us to speak the same language and, appreciate each other's position. And then we can find kind of common ground and from there. And that's really where that innovative partnership model might emerge. And that's a lot of the work of, what we're doing in this bundling assets project is how can those conversations lead to a unique combination of groups that maybe they hadn't seen possible before, but in taking the time to build that relationship side, they were able to emerge as a great new model for working together.
Yeah, I just add that there isn't one model that everyone follows. There generally is an organization that takes the lead, one or two organizations. It could be a public housing authority. It could be a co-op or a regional network of co-ops. It could be a community land trust, or it could be a bunch of organizations using a community land trust as a partnership model. And it could be a supportive housing provider, particularly if they have interest in development. So there's all kinds of different leadership. There's one thing that's been in common, I think, of all of the models that we've looked at, is that there's been someone external facilitating the process, which seems to be really important in terms of coming to an agreement, because there's always concerns about losing power or losing control, or to what extent are you engaging in financial risk. What ends up happening varies a little bit as well. Although what we're seeing, like what we'd see as a success, and I think what they'd see as a success, because we asked that question, is a lot more non-market homes built, a lot less time spent responding to individual requests for proposals, and more time spent in coming up with a proactive pipeline. But also some intangibles, but they're really important: mentorship, mutual support, being able for it to be non-market led as opposed to sort of reacting to what governments do in a stop-start way. So these are all things that we've seen are coming up as markers of success.
Very cool. Carolyn, your recent research has looked deeply at financing and the role of federal policy. What are some of the most promising financing mechanisms or policy levers for accelerating non-market housing right now?
There's a lot going on in this finance sphere right now, and that's really great, and it's really important. So, government programs, for instance, under the NHS, to some extent, they're winding down a bit because of the end of the first national housing strategy, which ends in 2027, which is like a year from now. There's new opportunities through federal programs like Build Canada Homes, but what often happens is that these funding programs, you have to apply for multiple programs. Sometimes the provincial criteria isn't the same as the federal criteria, isn't the same as the municipal criteria. So while government finance is key for non-market housing, there's been an increased interest in social and impact financing on the one hand, with a lot of really community bonds offered through Tapestry or the Canadian Active Transport Finance Group that coming out of Social Innovation Canada that are putting together funds, or New Market Funds, which is a older fund. So there's social and impact investment, and the hardest nut to crack so far has been the literal trillions of dollars that are in banks and in investment funds. So I think the challenge there, and one that I've started working on a little bit, is what do ESG guidelines, what does ethical investment in housing look like? When I'm an older person who invests in things in my pension funds, I don't want to invest in child labor. I don't want to invest in coal. And I also don't want to invest in housing groups that are making a lot of money by evicting people. I'd rather invest in something that maybe has more of a bond type return, like 4 or 5%, but that also provides the knowledge that I'm investing in future generations and affordable housing that's going to stay perpetually affordable, as non-market housing is much more likely to do. So the real nut to crack right now is how are we going to get some institutional investment in non-market housing, specifically affordable housing, a little more generally.
Can I ask you, when you think about banks and the possibility of affordable housing being an investment vehicle, how do you see, because affordable housing is by nature expensive and hard to support over the long term, how do you actually see that, like, economically playing out successfully?
Well, I think that there has to be a commitment to look not only at what's providing the greatest return in terms of money or cash return, but also what's providing the biggest social return, even when it's institutional investment. And quite often, as I say, there's sort of voluntary disclosures that happen around the conditions of employees or the environmental record of a firm, but we don't really have that for housing yet. I did a bit of work with an organization called SHARE last year. It's a shareholders research and education group on what rights-based ethical investment in housing would look like. Will it bring 20 or 25% returns, as some real estate investment trusts have been at least promising? Probably not. But will it bring a steady return while having less risk, both reputational risk of investing in something that's clearly unethical, but also financial risk of bouncing up and down in the way that some market housing, for instance, condos, have been happening lately? I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying I have a simple solution for that, but what I'm saying is that's one of the next challenges that is before us as a society. And it's very much connected with the future of non-market housing, because if we're going to double non-market housing, as some folks have been calling for, including Scotiabank, or if we're going to increase non-market housing to 20%, like France said it would do in 2020 and actually did in 2020, that's attached to a big old revolving fund that has both government and private investment in it. So that's one of the key mechanisms to scale up non-market housing.
Adrienne, you've spoken about bundling assets as one strategy for growth. Can you unpack for our listeners what bundling assets actually means and how it fits within the broader toolkit for scaling up the sector?
Yeah, so the conversation about bundling assets is really kind of building off of what Carolyn shared about the case studies that that she's looked at, and this idea of the portfolio approach. And what we're doing in this initiative is we're looking at bundling assets, as you said, Emmy, as one pathway to scale. So this isn't for everyone. This is one way or model of series of models of how to achieve scale in housing. So what we're working on is translating those initiatives that Carolyn was speaking of. So, Bumblebee and Plancher and the BCCLT, and looking at, what is the formula or the anatomy of those models that other people can pick up and replicate and maybe do in their own jurisdiction based on what makes sense for them in their, based on their local geography or the people that they're trying to serve. So we're looking at scale both from what can groups do together when they come together, and then the scaling through replication of these types of models. And so what we've seen in terms of the patterns so far that formulate kind of the formula of bundling is that of all the examples that Carolyn mentioned, in every case, there is some sort of ambitious long-term goal about growth that's at the heart of the bundling. So that's in large part, that's the motivation, at least for most of the groups involved. So this is about repeated collaboration. So the groups that are coming to the table are saying, we want to do this for the long term. This is not about just how do we build one project together, but how do we do this over and over and over and make it easier to do it every time? And so there's a long-term view here. And so that's really the piece where it goes beyond just pooling for a one-off project. So those are some of the criteria we're seeing so far. And then what makes up a model? So usually there's groups of bundlees. So who are the organizations who are actually bringing something to the table? And what we've seen so far is that everyone is bringing something to the table, and the equation only works if everyone's contributing. So they might bring any of the bundled assets to the table, which could be land, of course. You could bring land to a pool, and then that forms a land trust, just as an example of the route that you could go. You could pool financial capital, so leveraging our balance sheets as a group. That's what the Plancher model was working on. You can bring together and pool human capital. So do we have capabilities that we can all bring to the table, more similar to the Bumblebee initiative? So each group is bringing something, and then there has to be a mechanism that's actually used to pool or tie these assets together. So it goes beyond just, saying, hey, let's have a nice conversation about collaboration, but there's actually some sort of mechanism that is tying these assets together. So back to the example of a land trust, you're actually transferring your land to a land trust. And so that's, the land trust is holding title. So that's kind of the tie. That's the mechanism that's holding that bundle together. And then usually there's some sort of venue for where those bundled assets reside. So that could be, you could call that the bundler, or like, where is that place where these assets are being pooled? Sometimes we've seen groups create a new entity. So maybe it's a new organization emerges from this bundling opportunity initiative. Or maybe it's an existing entity that says, hey, I'm going to be like the anchor organization here, and we'll take on kind of the role of stewarding the assets and helping with that pooling function. So that's where we are so far. And we're looking at, in different examples, how each group might take those ingredients and put it together in a different way, and a different model and initiative emerges. So how can we make it easier for people to pick up those puzzle pieces and build the bundling initiative that makes sense for them in their local jurisdiction? That's kind of the challenge to be solved right now through the work that we're doing.
I love all the bundling. When Blue Door was working through Housing for All, it started first, we launched the corporation. We wanted to do something for our larger geography of York Region. And when we heard you both hosting workshops on the bundling and all, we wanted to learn more about the details of that. But to your point, and I think for our listeners, there isn't like a magic bullet of bundling that's already been kind of structured and prescribed. It is really about being opportunistic in your communities and with the sector and the organizations to see what is possible, how can we achieve scale, and how can we push the agenda of non-market housing forward. And I think that, like, from what both of you are sharing, there's so much opportunity for us in the sector and in our geographies to think very differently about how we can create housing at scale. Like when I first saw the BCH, the first draft of the BCH piece, I was like, 300 units minimum. Oh my goodness, that shut so many people or good organizations out of the mix. But then as I thought about it more, I thought, well, here's an opportunity, right? Like, we need to create housing at scale. So it is really about setting aside some of the way we've thought about it so far and collaborating together to push the sector forward at a much faster pace. So I know I just said that there wasn't a structure in place, but I'm going to jump in to say that we often hear that data and standardized tools are critical to housing policy, like the HEART project at UBC. Carolyn, how do you both see data and shared frameworks shaping the next generation of housing solutions?
Ooh, that's a big question. I mean, certainly, as you know, Emmy, I worked with the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project, and that needs assessment tool has been adopted by the federal government, trying to get comparable and replicable needs assessment out there. And part of the challenge, especially for smaller communities, is that the federal government has a lot of this data. So why not just make it available for smaller communities rather than expect them to generate it themselves? I think that with the new national housing strategy, because there does need to be a new one, all of the bilateral agreements with the provinces end in 2027, the programs are already starting to wind down, including the Affordable Housing Fund. What I'd love to see is a much more evidence-based way that has targets that aren't just about reducing homelessness or reducing core housing need, which is really important, but some sense of how that's going to happen through the programs and some way of measuring it. It is a big challenge. I mean, unfortunately, under the first national housing strategy, homelessness has gotten worse. A whole bunch of factors, including COVID and decreasing affordability of housing, cascading into that. Core housing need has, at best, not budged. And again, there were some things that temporarily worked, like emergency response benefits, but then ended. So I think that the future in Canada has to have a roadmap for scaling. It's going to include, to get to your question, some aspect of better zoning and building codes to allow replicable industrial construction of, 3 to 4 story apartment buildings, to allow, hopefully allow supportive housing everywhere, so some of it has to do with that. Some of that has to do with a modernized non-market sector. And I lived in Australia, worked in Australia for a long time, and non-market housing providers have a market-owned registry system. And I see the CHRA starting to look at that. The UK also has a registry system. So I think that, there's going to need to be really a modernized non-market sector to take advantage of those opportunities. It's challenging, and it's the exact same story, whether you're talking about industrial construction or whether you're talking about non-market development. If you aren't able to guarantee a steady pipeline, you can't offer the good jobs. You can't offer the opportunities for people to, have a career in the non-market sector. You can't build a factory. You can't staff the factory. So there's all of these things that mean that we need to move towards much more of a pipeline approach. And the Bundling Assets project is one very small part of it. And the work that Adrienne is doing and that I'm doing on other projects, like, for instance, financing, or some of the work that's going on with particular organizations, are all part of that project.
Amazing. Adrienne, did you have a bit more to add?
Well, I'll just jump on your one point, Emmy, about you said one of the points you said was about shared frameworks. How do they shape the next generation? So maybe I'll make one point on that one. And you were talking about the Build Canada Homes initiative, and it feels like taking advantage of that opportunity is forcing us to create shared frameworks. It's forcing us to speak about, what are some of our assumptions in the system? What are some of the language and the norms and what we call like the orthodoxies that are hard to see, but we need to take the time to actually reveal those and unearth them for each of our organizations, because that's what allows us to work together. And because there is a lot of energy around taking advantage of these initiatives, it's giving us that opportunity to have those conversations and maybe to see each other in a way that we didn't before. And that's maybe where some of the opportunities can come out through those shared frameworks.
So looking at your combined work, from research to systems design, what are some examples of regional collaboration or innovation labs? I know you shared some, Carolyn, if there's more to add, that have shown real scalable results.
Well, as I say, there's about, let's say 25, maybe I'd even say 30, really big thinking non-market providers across Canada. Some of them are regional, and certainly the BC Community Land Trust, which with 3,000 homes is a going concern. Some of them are national, and I think of organizations like Habitat for Humanity, or some of the work that's been supported by New Market Funds as a national type initiative. I know that we did a workshop in Manitoba. Again, I've been doing a lot of the provincial nonprofit housing associations this year, and I think Manitoba has the policy settings right for the first time in a while, and there's a lot of newer organizations that are really interested in scaling things up in the way that they need to be scaled. And I'd be really remiss if I didn't talk about the amazing work that's being done by some Indigenous-led housing, particularly in BC. So yesterday, Adrienne and I were talking to the Aboriginal Land Trust, which is associated with LUMA, and there's Makola, and there's AMA there. These are all like acronyms for Indigenous-led housing that's off-reserve. There's also some really amazing First Nations work done by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations right now, with Canada Lands, without Canada Lands, that are really showing the way forward. And, to get away from BC for a moment, also did a presentation to a group of co-ops in Newfoundland. So I think there's a lot of potential going on, definitely in Nova Scotia. There's some amazing work being done by co-ops, by Community Land Trust, in PEI in Alberta. I mean, I could sort of ramble on, but there's some wonderful regional work that's going on and some wonderful national work that's going on. So I look out in my little helicopter on the landscape of non-market housing, and I see a sector that's on the verge of some really exciting transformation.
Maybe I'll just give a little shout out to two other land trusts that are doing interesting work that are serving kind of local population groups. So the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust and the Upper Hammonds Plains Community Land Trust, both with just amazing teams behind those groups, and they're exciting, of course, because they're newer. So of course, new things are always exciting, but what's interesting about them is that they face really different challenges. So they might not be, a lot of, we've been talking about making change and changing your organization and steering the ship while, these longstanding organizations in housing, that's one, big challenge to overcome for them because they're newer. They may have fewer of those challenges, but they're actually trying to challenge the status quo of what does it mean to steward real estate in their communities, and they both have really unique approaches to that and unique approaches to what it means to be a member and what community governance looks like in their organizations. So would encourage folks to check out those two groups in Toronto and in Upper Hammonds Plains in Nova Scotia who are really kind of leading the way with this too.
Yeah, I mean, Upper Hammond, a lot of the community land trusts are interesting because they're about housing, but they're also about cultural and economic development. And Upper Hammond's Plains is a historically Black, originally Loyalist community, so 200 years of Black people living in that part of Nova Scotia, but not much in the way of affordable housing or home ownership opportunities. And that's a really, land trusts come out of Black communities in the South US that were concerned about stewarding their land. And it's really cool to see that kind of culturally informed approaches starting to affect Canada.
This is really interesting, and I know myself, for one, I'm going to start searching those up and reading more, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate hearing all those new ideas and possibilities and organizations that are doing great work and innovating. Finally, because we could talk all day with you both, I have to ask you, what gives you hope amidst the challenges of affordability, supply, systemic barriers? What gives you hope in Canada's housing landscape?
Yeah, there was a point a couple of months ago where I was like, oh my God, not this again. So it's a very timely question. I guess what gives me hope is that I think we're going to step forward and one step back rather than the obverse, one step forward and two steps back. So I think there's a greater understanding now about what affordable housing is in government policy. That's kind of cool. There's definitely a greater understanding of the role of government land for non-market housing, which is, again, something that Hart worked on, that I've worked on for a long time. So I'm really excited about that. And as I say, there's just so many good ideas and so many really promising organizations across Canada. So I've been doing a lot of travel over the last year. I mentioned New Brunswick and Manitoba, and we're in BC, and the next year I'm going to Edmonton and Calgary, and maybe Newfoundland. And so it's happening all over the place, which is really exciting. It happens differently in different communities. Like, obviously it's going to happen differently in Nunavut, which is northern. It's going to happen differently in a less big city context in the east. But it's happening all over. The people are not only coming up with good ideas, but some of those good ideas are actually happening, which is really what this project's all about.
Carolyn, before we pass to Adrienne, if I may recycle a point that you made for this question on the episode we lost. Sorry again. It stuck with me a lot. You said you had left Canada for a while, and when you came back, a lot of the leadership in housing had changed, and you noticed a great shift from a more territorial mindset to a visionary mindset of we need to solve this come hell or high water. Tell us a little bit about that for the hope so that we can model that behavior.
Well, there's definitely a generational shift happening. When I got back, I found a lot of people who are even slightly older than me in their 70s, still dominating a lot of the discourse. And now I see a lot of younger people who are, and more diverse people who are part of the discourse, which is really exciting to me. And I might have told you this story, but now that you've brought it up, I'm going to indulge it. I was involved in an international project. It wasn't on housing, it was on women in cities, 15 years ago. And I always say the biggest sign of success of that project is that when it started, it was all women in their 40s and 50s. I was in my 40s then. And when it ended, the leadership were all women in their 20s. And and it was a 3-year project. So that was a big transformation in a short period of time. So, at a certain point, I'm really looking forward to stepping away gracefully. And what gives me a lot of hope is that there's a lot of people who are really, doing amazing work, young people. Younger than me, which is most people, I think.
Adrienne.
Well, I had a list of 3 items, and one of them was the next generation of leaders, so +1 on that one. And then I would say the other points I was going to make was around the urgency of the moment feels like it's creating momentum. So Build Canada Homes. We can have a whole other session on the critique of it, and I'm sure Carolyn would love to weigh in on that one. But at a minimum, it has us talking, and it has us moving, and it has us taking action, and it has us kind of trying to build on the urgency of the moment. So I think there's something there that is happening and stirring, and it feels like there's a little bit more buzzing energy, which is good. And then I guess the next one around, it does feel like the narrative around joining forces to do more is strong. It feels, and I think this is what you were getting at earlier, but that does feel like a shift. So it does feel like it's being seen less as you said, territorial. I was going to think of the word of like adversarial, or the idea of loss of control of one's destiny, and actually more about how can we create our own destiny? How can we focus on that mission of affordable housing for all, and it not be baked into egos or the future of my organization. So that conversation feels like it's really shifted, and I think that also brings us hope for the future as well.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for taking the time today and for sharing your insights, and for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Emmy. Second time's the charm.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you both. Thank you so much to Adrienne and Carolyn for joining me on the way home. Their insights remind us that scale isn't just about numbers, it's about systems that work together, leadership that collaborates, and a shared commitment to housing as a human right. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe and share this episode with others working to build a better housing future. You can find podcasts wherever you get your podcasts, and learn more about the work behind On the Way Home at onthewayhome.ca. This podcast is brought to you by Blue Door.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.